Welcome back. Thanks for joining us again. So to summarize what we talked about last time, we said that Silvio Gesell's economic perspective is based on the idea that the free market system is the best way for society to provide for its material needs, but that what we know as capitalism is a diseased variant of that system due to our unnatural, irrational systems of land and money. If that's the case, the whole notion of choosing between capitalism and socialism is misguided, because supporting the free market system does not equate to acceptance of the capitalistic status quo. And conversely, criticizing the capitalistic status quo does not discredit the free market system. Gesell tells us that we do not need to choose between the free market system and the goals of socialism. In fact, he says that the perfection of the free market system is the best way to achieve the objectives of socialism, if by socialism we mean the goal of enabling workers to receive the full proceeds of their labor. So the best path forward is not to throw out the baby with the bathwater and replace decentralized markets with centralized control of the economy, but rather to fix our systems of land and money, thereby enabling the free market system to actually deliver on its theoretical promise of a rising tide that lifts all boats. Since this course is being hosted by the Henry George School, many of you are already familiar with the land side of the subject. Gesell's analysis of the land issue is very similar to that of Henry George, although his proposed solution is different. We'll get to that in a future class. But starting today and for the next few sessions, we'll focus on the subject of money. This will be the most mentally challenging part of the course, both because money is a complex subject and also because the Gesellian perspective on money is fundamentally at odds with many preconceived notions that we have believed for our whole lives, but in all likelihood never consciously examined. As I put it last time, our existing form of money behaves as if it were magnetically charged. It flows toward where there's already too much of it, and it flows away from where there's not enough. This is why our economic system always tends toward greater and greater wealth inequality. This is also why money periodically seizes up and fails to circulate, causing economic crises. Many of the specific manifestations of dysfunction throughout our economic system can ultimately be diagnosed as circulatory disorders caused by our irrational form of money. And this, incidentally, is why I view Silvio Gesell as a completion of the economic perspective of Henry George. They both agree that the free market system is fundamentally sound, but that our existing implementation of that system is flawed. They both agree that the problem arises in the process of exchange, not in the process of production. This sets them both apart from Karl Marx. Henry George sees the entire problem arising from the single cause of private ownership of land. According to this view, if we fix the land problem, the free market system will produce a rising tide that lifts all boats. Silvio Gesell agrees that land is one of the primary causes of economic dysfunction, but he says that addressing the land issue is not enough to solve the problem. Henry George essentially sees all of the poison entering the economic system at the source, where we draw energy and resources from the earth. Silvio Gesell says that yes, poison enters the system at the source, but poison is also generated inside of the system, at every point where exchange is facilitated by our irrational form of money. Thus, if we want to experience economic health, we must change our relationship with the source, the earth and all of its bounty, and we must also reconstitute the blood flowing through the economic organism. Either change by itself will not solve the problem. This is why I said during the Q&A last week that in my view, the land and money issues cannot be separated. As I mentioned last time, there's been a resurgence of interest in Gesell's ideas since the 2008 financial crisis, largely because what happened was a textbook example of what he described. In response to the turbulence following the collapses of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, The world's central banks created unprecedented amounts of new money, but they were powerless to make that money circulate. There's a term to describe such a situation. We say that the central banks were pushing on a string. According to Gesell, this situation is a consequence of the irrational design of our existing form of money. From a Gessellian perspective, such a situation would never arise in an economy composed only of real goods and services. It occurs because we have misunderstood the appropriate functions of money and created a form of economic blood that does not flow properly or naturally. And this unnatural blood flow is the root cause of a variety of problems that have plagued economies for thousands of years. So to give you a preview of what's to come in the next few sessions, first, we're going to talk about what money is as we currently know it. Then we're going to highlight a fundamental problem with our existing form of money, an inherent incompatibility between money's functions. We're then going to move on to the subject of interest. We'll examine various theories of interest, the reasons why other economic thinkers believe interest exists. Then we'll look at Silvio Gesell's explanation for the existence of interest. After that, we'll discuss the various consequences of interest, such as how interest causes economic inequality, how it affects wages, how it affects the availability of housing, how it causes economic instability, and how it's the driving force behind our pathological pursuit of growth. And then finally, we'll look at Gesell's proposal for a different form of money which would solve these problems. Before we start, I need to address a complication relating to applying Gesell's critique of the monetary system of his time to the present day. Gesell developed his theory in the era of the classical gold standard, when most major world currencies were linked to gold. Obviously, today, no major currencies are linked to gold. So one might reasonably ask if Gesell's analysis of money is still relevant today. I would answer that it absolutely is. Modern forms of government fiat money have most of the same fundamental problems that gold-backed money had, plus a few additional ones. But it would be difficult to modify Gesell's analysis at every step along the way in order to show how it applies to our modern form of money. So instead, what I plan to do is to first go through Gesell's monetary critique in the context of his time, that is, as it relates to gold-backed money. And once we've done that, we'll discuss whether his analysis applies to modern fiat money as well. Gesell starts his discussion of money with the following statement. Metal money of the present day is in all essentials identical with the money that exchanged the products of antiquity. Gold money unearthed from the ruins of Athens, Rome, or Carthage is universally acceptable and circulates freely with the money of modern Europe or America. Apart from possible differences in the fineness of the gold, a kilogram of coins with the stamp of a Roman emperor is equal to a kilogram of coins with the stamp of the German mint. Our money has all the characteristics of the money that Lycurgus banished from Sparta. Money is perhaps the only state institution that we have adapted unchanged from antiquity. He goes on, our knowledge of the nature of money is by no means proportionate to its great antiquity. The investigators who have penetrated into the dark continent of monetary science can still be counted on the fingers. Such is the explanation of the startling fact that although in every other sphere, science passes from triumph to triumph, we have as yet no sound definition or theory of metal money. Metal money has been in existence for 4,000 years, has during 100 generations passed through thousands of millions of hands. Yet in the management of money, every country in the world is guided not by science, but simply by routine. The lack of a sound theory of money is the reason why the phenomenon of interest has never been satisfactorily explained. For 4,000 years, we have paid and received countless thousands of millions in interest. Yet science is at the present day incapable of answering the question, whence and why does the capitalist receive interest? Attempts to solve the problem of interest have not indeed been wanting. As an obvious disturber of the peace, interest has received a far larger share of public and scientific attention than money. All economists of note have dealt with this problem, especially the socialists, whose whole effort is fundamentally directed against interest. But in spite of all these attempts, the problem of interest remained unsolved. The failure is not due to the difficulty of the subject, but to the fact that capital interest is the child or byproduct of our traditional form of money, and can therefore be scientifically explained only with the help of a theory of money. Money and interest, to the superficial observer inseparable friends, have also a close interconnection, the connection in theory. A theory of interest can only be deduced from a theory of money. Oddly enough, most economists prior to Silvio Gesell basically ignored the subject of money. Adam Smith and Karl Marx both examined the subject of interest, but they spent almost no time investigating the nature of money itself. Both viewed money as being defined by the substance of which it's made, gold or silver, and therefore didn't see any need to study it specifically. For them, exchanging apples for lumber was not qualitatively different than exchanging apples for gold and then gold for lumber. They were all just different instances of the exchange of commodities. So why would there be any need to make a special study of money? Gesell, however, recognized that money is not defined by the material of which it's made. This is obvious today, since most money today doesn't have any material existence at all. But this was far from obvious when Gesell developed his theory. He understood that money is not a commodity existing in nature. It's a tool made by man. Gold exists in nature. Money does not. The designation by society of an instrument as legal tender, that it must by law be accepted as payment for any and all goods and services, as well as for taxes and other government fees, is money's defining characteristic. And that characteristic makes it completely different from any other substance, any commodity, or any good or service. So it's no surprise that those who viewed money as just another commodity failed to grasp its essence, its special nature, and all of the consequences of how it's constituted. If money is something which emerged naturally over the millennia to perform its functions by virtue of its intrinsic value, its divisibility, its widespread demand, etc., as the commodity view of money would have us believe, then it makes sense that no one would have thought about the possibility of separating its functions, which is the essence of Gesell's proposal. But if money is in fact a tool created by society for a specific purpose or purposes, then it's entirely reasonable to consider the possibility of separating its functions. So, what are the functions of money? The standard textbook definition of money is that it's an instrument that performs three primary functions: medium of exchange, store of value, and unit of account. So let's take each of these functions individually. We'll start with medium of exchange. In order to understand the importance of a medium of exchange, we need to start by analyzing the concept of the division of labor. The division of labor is the idea that in a community of people, the total amount of economic output will be greater if the members divide up the tasks necessary to provide for their material needs, such that each individual specializes in one particular area of production, as opposed to each individual or household working separately to provide for all of their needs independently of the larger community. Adam Smith began The Wealth of Nations by describing the division of labor. Clearly, in his mind, this is where the subject of economics begins. Smith famously illustrates the concept of the division of labor by describing the operations of a pin factory. I'd like to read that passage for you. He writes, "To take an example from a very trifling manufacture, but one in which the division of labor has been very often taken notice of, the trade of a pin maker, a workman not educated to this business, which the division of labor has rendered a distinct trade, nor acquainted with the use of the machinery employed in it, to the invention of which the same division of labor has probably given occasion, could scarce, perhaps with his utmost industry, make 1 pin in a day, and certainly could not make 20. But in the way in which this business is now carried on, not only the whole work is a peculiar trade, but it is divided into a number of branches, of which the greater part are likewise peculiar trades. One man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business. To whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them into the paper. And the important business of making a pin is in this manner divided into about 18 distinct operations, which in some manufactories are all performed by distinct hands, though in others the same man will sometimes perform 2 or 3 of them. I've seen a small manufactory of this kind where 10 men only were employed, and where some of them consequently performed 2 or 3 distinct operations. But though they were very poor and therefore but indifferently accommodated with the necessary machinery, they could, when they exerted themselves, make among them about 12 pounds of pins in a day. There are in a pound upwards of 4,000 pins of a middling size. Those 10 persons therefore could make among them upward of 48,000 pins in a day, each person therefore making a 10th part of 48,000 might be considered as making 4,800 pins in a day. But if they had all wrought separately and independently, and without any of them having been educated to this peculiar business, they certainly could not each of them have made 20 and perhaps not 1 pin in a day. That is certainly not the 240th, perhaps not the 4,800th part of what they are at present capable of performing in consequence of a proper division and combination of their different operations. So the first thing to note is that the division of labor doesn't just increase the productivity of labor by 10% or 50% or 100%. It increases it by thousands or tens of thousands of percents or even more. The example of a pin factory was chosen because it shows the incredible magnitude of the increase of productivity caused by the division of labor, even in a very simple manufacturing process. Now imagine how many times more the productivity of individual labor is magnified by the division of labor when it comes to manufacturing a smartphone or a car. An individual working alone couldn't produce 1 iPhone or 1 Toyota, even if he or she spent an entire lifetime working on it. Given the enormous power of the division of labor to increase the productivity of human labor, it directly follows that the vast majority of all of the wealth on Earth owes its existence to the division of labor. If the 10 people in the pin factory had been working individually and separately, they could not have made a combined total of 200 pins in a day. But working together, they could make 48,000. That means almost all of their output only exists because of the division of labor. It's therefore not an overstatement to say that 99% of everything we buy, use, and consume would not exist if individuals and families still worked separately and independently to provide for their material needs. Barack Obama in 2012 somewhat inartfully said, quote, "If you've got a business, you didn't build that." He could definitely have expressed himself better, but he was making a valid and important point. Almost no one in the modern division of labor system can really be thought of as being solely responsible for the creation of whatever good or service they produce. So if we were to want to put rough percentages to the question of who or what is the true source of wealth, it might be something like this. 49% is due to the bounty of nature. 49% is due to the coordination of human effort accomplished through the division of labor, and 1% is due to individual effort. Of course, those are wild approximations. There's plenty of discussion that could be had about how to apportion the 99%, between nature and society. But the important point for the purposes of this discussion is the minuscule part that true individual effort represents in the overall process of wealth creation. The next thing to observe about the division of labor is that it requires exchange. Once people switch over from individual or family-based self-sufficient production to the division of labor, virtually no one produces all or even most of the things they need to survive. In fact, many people don't directly consume any of their own produce under an advanced division of labor system. This is a monumentally important change in terms of how society sustains the lives of its members. As soon as people give up self-sufficiency, they put their very survival in the hands of the community. Since no one any longer produces all of the things he or she needs to survive, successful exchange literally becomes a matter of life and death. So we should never lose sight of the fact that in an advanced division of labor system, nothing is more important than the reliability and robustness of the exchange process, the ability to convert the product of your individual labor into all of the other things you need to survive. Abandoning self-sufficient production for the division of labor is a hopeful aspirational act. It reflects the belief that by working together, we can all live much better lives. But it's also important to recognize that it involves very serious risks as well. With self-sufficient production, we cannot achieve a high standard of living, but we can achieve a relatively secure basic existence. If there were an unexpected disaster resulting in a sustained breakdown of the global process of economic exchange, how would the modern-day city dweller fare in comparison with a self-sufficient farmer? If the mechanisms of exchange break down completely, a Manhattanite would be lucky to survive a week, and most of the population would certainly perish inside of a month, whereas a self-sufficient farmer could potentially survive indefinitely. Of course, the other side of the coin is that when the exchange process is functioning normally, the Manhattanite enjoys many things that the self-sufficient farmer could never even dream of having access to. So choosing to give up self-sufficiency in order to adopt the division of labor reflects two fundamental beliefs. One, that the fruits of the division of labor are so superior to self-sufficient production that it's worth accepting some additional risk in order to reap the rewards. And two, we trust enough in the robustness of exchange that we deem the likelihood of ever being unable to obtain the necessities of life as very small. The next point to note is that in order for the division of labor to progress very far, a medium of exchange is required. The alternative, direct exchange of goods and services, that is, barter, is highly impractical and has rarely been a widespread form of exchange on any significant scale throughout history. This is primarily due to the problem known as coincidence of wants. In other words, for two people to make a successful exchange via barter, person A needs to want what person B has at the same time and place and in the correct proportions that person B wants what person A has. And more often than not, wants do not coincide. What happens if person A wants what person B has, but person B wants what person C has, and person C wants what person A has? Barter does not easily lend itself to facilitating such exchanges. And this is where a medium of exchange comes into the picture. A medium of exchange solves the coincidence of wants problem. If everyone agrees to use a generally accepted form of payment instead of direct exchange, person A can use the medium of exchange to purchase what person B has. Person B, in turn, can use the medium of exchange to buy what person C has, and person C can then buy what person A has. The introduction of a medium of exchange vastly expands the scope of possible exchanges when compared to barter. Now think of any complex modern product. Think of a smartphone, think of a car. Now think about the extent of the division of labor which is necessary to produce those items. From digging the raw materials out of the ground to having a completed smartphone, there are probably tens of thousands of discrete steps involved. it's hard to imagine how an economy that had to rely on barter could ever achieve the coordination necessary to produce a smartphone. In fact, it's hard to imagine how such a society could produce a toaster oven. Think about your daily life. Think about all of the items you use or consume. Now think about the scale of the division of labor that's necessary to produce those items. How many of those items could possibly be produced within the extremely limited constraints on the division of labor that would be present in a barter economy? Everything else owes its existence to the use of a medium of exchange. So now let's talk about money's other primary function, store of value. Let's say your area of specialization within the division of labor system is the production of milk. You're a dairy farmer. If you were living in a non-monetary, that is, a barter economy, how would you ever accumulate the purchasing power to buy a car or a house? Your product has a shelf life of a couple weeks at best. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to ever have enough of your product on hand at one time to barter for big-ticket items. Money, in its capacity as a store of value, provides a way to convert the product of your labor into a form that can be accumulated until you have enough to buy a car. So these are the two primary functions of money, medium of exchange and store of value. As I mentioned before, economics textbooks also include a third function, namely unit of account. A unit of account is a standard measure which can be used to express the prices of all of the different goods and services that make up an economy. In a barter economy, one would need to have as many different prices as there are products. One would need to know how many eggs a gallon of milk is worth. One would also need to know how many eggs a shirt is worth, and how many eggs an hour of babysitting services is worth. A unit of account allows us to express all prices in a common measure which can be easily compared with other prices. Obviously, this is an important function. However, I would argue that the unit of account function is implicit in the medium of exchange function. The unit of account is simply whatever increment is used to measure or count the quantity of the instrument that is used as a medium of exchange. If the medium of exchange is gold, the unit of account is an ounce or gram of gold. If the medium of exchange is corn, the unit of account is a pound or bushel of corn. In fact, can we even imagine a medium of exchange which would not also perform the unit of account function? So while a unit of account is certainly important, I don't think it needs to be considered as a separate function from that of medium of exchange. I consider unit of account and medium of exchange as one combined function. So really, medium of exchange / unit of account and store of value are the two functions of money. Okay, so now let's make an observation about the natures of a medium of exchange and a store of value. Medium of exchange is a dynamic function. Money functions as a medium of exchange when it's in motion. Money in your wallet or in a bank vault is not functioning as a medium of exchange. It's only when it changes hands that it performs that function. Store of value, on the other hand, is a static function. For the most part, the purpose of a store of value is to stand still. So the dynamic characteristics of a medium of exchange and a store of value are essentially opposite. Now let's ask a question. While both are important functions, is it necessary that medium of exchange and store of value should be performed by the same instrument? Why couldn't we use corn as a medium of exchange and gold as a store of value? As I mentioned during the Q&A period in our last class, what I refer to as the original sin of money is the decision to join together these two functions and perform them using one instrument. As I've written about in an article on the Silvio Gesell Foundation Substack, creating one instrument to perform both the medium of exchange and store of value functions is like designing a car with one pedal to perform both the gas and brake functions. Gesell writes, "The power of money to effect exchanges, its technical quality from the mercantile standpoint, is in inverse proportion to its technical quality from the banking standpoint. Just as the technical quality of a gas brake pedal from a gas standpoint would be in inverse proportion to its technical quality from a braking standpoint. We started this class with the question of why money earns interest. Silvio Gesell argues that interest exists because we made the irrational decision to join our medium of exchange with our store of value. From his perspective, doing so was a fundamental mistake, and interest is the consequence of that mistake. So we need to examine the relationship between these two functions in depth. For this purpose, I like to draw an analogy between money and water. Water can flow and water can stand still. Flowing water represents money functioning as a medium of exchange. Still water represents money functioning as a store of value. Let's imagine that there's a stream with a community of people living on its banks. But this is no ordinary stream. This is a magic stream that enables people to transform the product of their labor into any other good or service that they want or need. The dairy farmer puts his milk into the stream and draws out of it bread, clothing, shelter, and everything else that he and his family need in order to live. This magic is the division of labor. The stream is a vital public resource, and the lives of everyone in the community depend on its flow. Now let's say that certain individuals choose to divert the flow of the stream in order to build private ponds. They do this so they will be sure to always have water in case the stream ever stops flowing. What would happen if everyone did this? Obviously, it would jeopardize the continuous flow of the stream on which everyone's survival depends. Furthermore, anytime someone saw another person building a pond and diverting water into a private store, he or she would have an incentive to do likewise. And the more people who build ponds, the stronger is the incentive for others to build ponds too. And due to the self-reinforcing dynamic of the incentives facing individuals to build ponds, the fear that motivated the construction of ponds in the first place becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Before long, everyone will obey the instinct of self-preservation and build a pond. And the collective consequences of doing so will be to bring about the circumstances against which the precaution of building ponds was meant to guard against. If the flow of the stream was always continuous and reliable, people wouldn't have to fear it ever running dry. But now, because of people taking precautions against that possibility, they've made it a reality. Because of everyone guarding against the flow of the stream becoming unreliable, the flow of the stream has in fact become unreliable. To bring the analogy back to the subject of money, by making the decision to use money as a store of value, we have made it unreliable in terms of performing its primary life-sustaining function as a medium of exchange. To repeat what Gesell said, the power of money to effect exchanges, its technical quality from a mercantile standpoint, is in inverse proportion to its technical quality from the banking standpoint. Now, because of the inherent tension between money's functions as medium of exchange and store of value, the flow of the stream becomes inconsistent. Sometimes too much water is diverted into ponds and the stream runs dry. And other times, everyone decides to release their private stores of water all at once, and the stream overflows its banks. Silvio Gesell tells us this is because the store of value function is an unnatural, incorrect use of money. This is an idea that most people would reflexively respond negatively to. The idea that money should be saved is so deeply ingrained in us that to suggest otherwise makes most people uncomfortable. But I would argue that this is another example of what I discussed in the previous class. Ideas which cause discomfort because they conflict with beliefs we've held our whole lives, but have perhaps never consciously examined. We're all taught from childhood that saving, using money as a store of value, is a good thing. We think of saving as responsible behavior and of thrift as a virtue. And while I would never go so far as to say that saving is inherently bad, I absolutely would challenge the notion that it's always beneficial. So this would be a good time to take a little detour and discuss a couple ideas from mainstream non-Gessellian schools of economic thought. Specifically, I want to first talk about a concept that comes from the classical school, and then one that comes from Keynes. One of the most fundamental ideas underlying the theory of free markets is what's known as Say's law, after the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say. The most concise formulation of Say's law is the idea that supply creates its own demand. What does that mean? The idea is that in a market-based economy built on the division of labor, anyone who produces a valuable good or service also creates the wherewithal for the purchase of that good or service. Since, as I mentioned previously, the classical school essentially ignores money and treats the economy as if it were composed purely of goods and services, the basic dynamic of exchange is that one party produces one good or service, another party produces another good or service, and they exchange their produce. So if I produce eggs and you produce beef, my eggs contain the purchasing power that buys your beef, and vice versa. So according to this view, there should never be products on the market without there also being the wherewithal to purchase those products. And if the economy really worked this way, there would never be a situation in which there's not enough demand to purchase all of the goods and services available. This is why the classical view says that the economy is self-correcting, and that there should never be a state of equilibrium in which there are unemployed resources. But remember, the classical school ignores the role of money. They treat the economy as if it were composed purely of goods and services. And it's quite likely that Say's law would apply if the economy really were composed only of goods and services. But something very interesting and significant happens when we introduce money into the equation. In direct exchange of goods and services, barter, the acts of buying and selling are part of the same action. It's a logical impossibility to sell without buying in a barter system. When one sells one's products in a barter transaction, they simultaneously buy an equivalent amount of someone else's products. So there's always an exact balance between buying and selling. But now let's think about what happens when instead of barter, exchange is accomplished via money. The first thing to note, and this is a hugely important point, is that in a monetary economy, buying and selling are separated into two distinct actions. I sell my eggs for money, then I use that money to buy your beef. But what if I decide not to do the second part? What if I sell my eggs and then just hold on to the money? Now, all of a sudden, buying and selling are no longer automatically balanced. And that means that Say's law does not necessarily apply. It's now possible for there to be an oversupply of goods and services if some people choose to sell their produce and then just hold on to the money they receive. In other words, if they save. Let's see what Silvio Gesell has to say about this issue. He writes, "Money was made to help the producer of wares to exchange his products for the products of other producers. Money is a medium of exchange and nothing more. Money makes exchange possible, and exchange is complete only when two producers have exchanged their products. When a producer has sold his product for money, exchange is not yet complete. Someone is in the market waiting for him. The purpose of money demands that the sale of a product for money shall immediately be followed by the purchase of a product with money to complete the exchange. Anyone hesitating with his purchase leaves exchange incomplete and interrupts the sale of another producer. This is a misuse of money. Without purchase, there can be no sale. Therefore, if money is to fulfill its purpose, purchase must follow step for step on the heels of sale." This aspect of money, the fact that buying and selling become two separate actions, is one of the key elements of the Keynesian analysis of the causes of economic crises. Keynes attributes the problem of recurring economic crises to this aspect of money, the fact that demand becomes optional in a monetary economy. Consider the following passage from the Economics of John Maynard Keynes by Dudley Dillard. Most people are so accustomed to viewing saving from their own individual point of view that it's difficult for them to think of saving from the social or community point of view. Saving is, to most people, putting money in the bank, or into securities, or into the mattress or an old sock. It is only by an act of conscious intellectual effort that we think far enough into the economic process of society to realize that saving is a two-sided affair. Attempts to save, which are successful so far as the individual is concerned, since he adds to his individual wealth, may be self-defeating and even positively harmful so far as society at large is concerned. We plan to save for society as well as for ourselves, but in the absence of cooperation from entrepreneurs, we do not assist society even when we attain our personal objectives. Putting part of a monthly salary into a savings account means only that an individual has not spent all of his income. The effect of not spending as such is to reduce the demand for consumption below what it would have been if the money which is saved had been spent. In the absence of some entrepreneur's action to invest, an act of individual saving will prove abortive for the community. It will merely reduce effective demand for consumption without any compensating increase in the demand for investment. The decrease in effective demand for consumption reduces employment and income. One of the important lessons of the general theory is that spending, rather than individual saving, is the essential condition of production and prosperity in an exchange economy where one man's spending is another man's income. So what does it mean that saving is a two-sided affair? It means that in order for an act of saving to be productive, for it to be fruitful, for it to create additional wealth, it has to be paired with an act of investment. If you've got $10,000 in earnings that you choose not to spend, that fact alone won't bear any fruit. Putting money in a safe doesn't generate a return. It's only if someone else has a productive use which that money can be put toward that those savings can be used to create additional wealth. So saving is an important and necessary part of the investment process, but it is not by itself a fruitful action. In fact, when you think about it, saving isn't an action at all. It's actually the lack of an action. It's the absence of the act of consumption. So now, getting back to the analogy of the stream, building ponds isn't necessarily harmful. Under the right conditions, it can be beneficial, both to the individual who builds the pond and to the community as a whole. But remember, the flow of the stream is the essential condition for the sustenance of life. Consumption is one form of flow, and investment is another form of flow. When one consumes, money flows to the people who produce the goods and services consumed. When one invests, money flows to employees, suppliers, etc. In both cases, money remains in motion. This is why, in order to benefit society, acts of saving must be matched with acts of investment. Money must be kept in motion. If it isn't, someone will be unable to find a buyer for the goods or services he or she produces and exchanges in order to procure all of the goods and services his or her family needs, but doesn't produce for themselves. So let's imagine two different pond construction projects. In the first case, someone just digs a hole and diverts the flow of water to fill the pond without considering the effects on the community. Let's say he does so at the height of summer, when the flow of the stream is already low. The pond may benefit the person who dug it, but the diversion of water is done at a time where it negatively impacts the flow of the stream and thus harms the community. Let's repeat part of the quote I just read. Attempts to save, which are successful so far as the individual is concerned, since he adds to his individual wealth, may be self-defeating and even positively harmful so far as society at large is concerned. This first pond building project may be harmful to the community, even if it benefits the person who builds the pond. Now let's imagine a second pond building project. Let's say that someone who produces more than he consumes knows someone else who's currently unemployed, but who wants to start a new business. If the saver puts his excess money at the disposal of the prospective entrepreneur, three things happen. First, the saver achieves his objective of setting aside wealth for future use. Second, an unemployed member of the community gains access to the resources he needs in order to engage in economic production. And third, water flows both into and out of the pond such that the flow of the stream is not adversely affected. In other words, unlike the first scenario in which an individual act of saving is self-defeating and harmful as far as the community is concerned, in the second scenario, the individual achieves his objective and the community benefits as well. So it's when there's indiscriminate, uncontrolled building of ponds without regard to corresponding investment activity that the impact on the community can be harmful. And remember that pond building is a self-reinforcing process because it's driven at least in part by fear. Individuals fear running out of water, so they build a pond. Then when other people see ponds being built, they start to worry that their access to water might be impacted, so they build ponds too. Pond building leads to more pond building. And this makes the danger which pond builders were guarding against, which may not have been very significant at first, all of a sudden become very real. In fact, it can become a matter of life and death. And this is essentially what happens during an economic crisis. Fear causes people to take steps to increase their individual security. They increase their own saving, which, remember, is actually more accurately described as decreasing their consumption. And since one man's spending is another man's income, a fear-induced chain reaction kicks off, which harms everyone. Now, like I said, we've all been brought up to believe that saving is a responsible, virtuous act. But Silvio Gesell would tell us that's because we've never experienced what life would be like in a world with a form of money that flows healthily and naturally. Our proclivity to save is partly pathological. Because we created a stream which cannot be relied upon to always flow as we need it to, we are understandably hyper-focused on building ponds. Many people consider the act of diverting water into ponds as a virtue unto itself, but it's not. It can be part of a process that benefits both the individual and the community, but diversion by itself creates nothing and can be harmful if done under the wrong circumstances. And here's the point I want to leave you with to think about between now and next week. The nature of our existing form of money creates the strongest incentives to engage in socially harmful acts of self-preservation at precisely the times when society most needs us not to. We reduce our spending when we notice that other people have reduced theirs. This initiates a self-reinforcing process that causes the mechanism of exchange to break down, because the instinct of self-preservation incentivizes us to stop observing the reciprocity that is a requirement for the division of labor system to function and upon which all of our lives depend. If we lived in a world where we knew that the stream would never run dry, that wouldn't mean that pond building would no longer happen, but it would be done with different motivations and incentives. It would be done in a constructive spirit, not from a place of fear. And the interests of individuals and the community would be more aligned than they are under our existing system. Now that we've sketched the broad outlines of the problem, in the next session, we'll look more specifically at the mechanics of how our existing form of money circulates. We'll show how the decision to include the store of value function along with that of medium of exchange guarantees that money will fail to perform the medium of exchange function. We'll then proceed to show how this failure is the root cause of interest. And then we'll examine the various ways in which interest distorts the circulatory system of the economic organism, which results in a wide variety of problems that pervade every area of our economic lives. So that's my presentation for tonight. Before we open the floor for questions, I want to see if Carlos Luj is with us. Carlos?
Carlos is here.
He is here. Okay,
Yes.
great. So before we get to questions and answers, we have a special guest with us tonight who I'd like to introduce. Carlos Luj is a lawyer and economist from Argentina. He's also the founder and director of the Silvio Gesell Institute in Buenos Aires. Carlos is one of the most knowledgeable people in the world on the subject of Silvio Gesell, and I was fortunate enough to get to know him about 4 years ago. Since then, we've spent countless hours on Zoom working on projects together and coordinating our efforts to promote the ideas of Silvio Gesell. Carlos is the author of a book that I mentioned in the last class called Keynes and Gesell, A New Paradigm. Unfortunately, that book hasn't been translated into English yet, but I hope that will happen soon. Carlos, the floor is yours. Introduce yourself.
Bueno, thank you very much and welcome everybody. Thank you for your invitation. I am very honored about this, and really is fulfilling big expectation to go to the English speakers world, so important with our Gesellian framework. As probably you already know, and Josh told us, Keynes and the modern economic framework was built through the Gesellian thoughts, and this was born in a crisis in Argentina. We also have crises periodically, and probably because we are not part of the center of the world, but of the periphery as well. So he observed things from the periphery, and in a different viewpoint, he can then write down a lot of observations that are really already today very modern and actual. So that's the first point I want to say. And of course, I want to thank publicly to Josh's work, because he's not only honest, but intellectually very honest on this issue, which of course is not very well known abroad. And I think we need to go deeper as far as crisis and economic failure, financial crisis, and of course, real estate bubbles, etc., are growing, and we can observe it directly, and we need answers for that. So this Gesellian proposal is very interesting, very clear, and very simple to understand. And then now we have a tool to change thinking and to find solutions, not only on financial and economic crisis, but about social issues as well. So it's a very practical thing. And of course, I repeat that we are very lucky to have Josh here, because he is making really great work, not only in the US, but in international. Now he's in contact with the professor in Edinburgh University. And we have, of course, another very important point in a Gesellian Institute in Germany. There are 2 or 3 Institute of Gesellian Economics in Germany, and we have ours more or less in 10 years ago, and we began these studies and publications 10 years ago after we have a big banking crisis. Maybe some of you have heard about it. Banks shut down and never give back the deposits and the money to the people. It was really incredible. So everybody understand what multiplier money bank means. Then we finally began this research and found a lot of information that is not well known and needs to go public. We published 4 books, but some other authors also did. And we found, maybe if you can, Josh, to the ones that are interested on it, we have a website with a Facebook page, a website with different lectures and information. And this allows us even to rebuild our national history, because we are so focused on financial culture and financial education that we miss the economic roots of production of classic economy. And that's only one point I want to underline, which is that now we are taught, even from the neoclassical liberalism point of view and the Marxist point of view, that we have 2 factors of production, which is labor and capital, which is not right, because we forgot another one, which is land or nature. We have three factors of production, not only two, or are always quarreling between them. That's a financial point of view that need to be, in our perspective, to be, of course, be healed, no, in a way that we can then go for sustainable goals, sustainable social, economic, and of course, ambiental issues to be healed, and of course, wars, etc., that are from scarcity and so on. So I think this is an opportunity even for modern times, for students, professors, thinkers, even universities, to discover this universe. So I'm very thankful to be invited, and I'm very proud of your work, Josh. And another thing I want to underline is that the so close thinking between Henry George and Silvio Gesell, very close. So I also want to underline that Gesell built this, it was really the author of the modern macroeconomics. This was also recognized by many important authors. Irving Fisher, the intellectual author of the New Deal from President Roosevelt, implies that he was just a pupil from Gesell's views. Guys make a reward for him. And if we go deeper, we can see that all macroeconomic tools have been designed, written, and practical made from Gesell's books. And the Argentine government, in the first monetary reform in 1899, really abandoned the gold pattern and the gold standard, and really is the new economy with a different way of thinking money. And these lessons has been very studied by the US and UK, Germany, European countries, and John H. Williams, especially. You have the Williams Administrative College in Harvard, which has the name of this guy that came to Argentina 2 years to study our monetary system. And then they can find out how can a political economy be driven without gold standard. So that's just an introduction about our where are we coming from. And really, we have a big world and universe to be discovered. Very interesting. It's really exciting, and it's in a positive way that we can then fix many of our problems. And then we have a key here with Josh and the Henry George School of Social Science. So a lot of work, and we have really an origin to be discovered here. So thank you very much, Josh, and I want to acknowledge your work and the work of the school, and hopefully we can continue working together. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Carlos. I'm glad you could join us.
Thank you very much, Josh, for this wonderful lecture again. And of course, thank you very much, Carlos, for joining us. It's a pleasure hearing from you, and we hope to invite you some other day for a lengthy conversation.